money.
Come on now.
And the movement.
I like both of those, actually.
Yes, money and the movement, yes. What does freedom from fossil fuels cost? But also, how much do we stand to gain? What are the risks we have to take? And what are the rewards we're going to get? As you know, they say freedom ain't free.
Come on.
But they also say no cash, no cause.
Right.
And of course, Wu-Tang said, cash rules everything around me.
Come on now.
Cream, get the money, dollar bill, y'all.
There it is.
All right.
We in Brooklyn, y'all.
But we in Brooklyn, that's right. Wu-Tang forever. That is true.
They don't know Wu-Tang.
But that is true in the movement, too. There is no climate victory without money to fund the transition to clean energy.
That's true.
So tonight we have two guests who we're going to dive into these questions
excited.
with from their perspectives. Ellen Dorsey is going to talk about philanthropy and investing and her journey leading the Wallace Global Fund in a new era. What did I say? Did I say that right?
You were talking about the new era.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The new era with returns and more effective giving. And Amy Goodman is going to talk about the media and the movement and her journey of putting herself on the line.
I thought you were going to say Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh.
That's where Ellen is from.
Okay, that's right.
Pittsburgh's
that's
in the building.
Right. That is right.
There's two from Pittsburgh in the building.
Putting herself on the line to tell stories of activists on the front lines. If people on the front lines can risk all they have, then certainly the rest of us can do more.
That's right.
A truly incredible lineup, Antonique. So I say, let's not delay any longer. We have a few short videos that will play before each of our guests come on stage. And for those of you who are listening on the podcast, you'll hear Antonique's voice, and she will be sharing about the guests and the things that they're going to be talking about. So without further ado, please play the video so that we can get this show started. And our first guest is Miss Ellen Dorsey.
Dr. Ellen Dorsey is Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund, a private foundation focused on progressive social change in the fields of environment, democracy, human rights, and corporate accountability. Under her leadership, the fund is recognized for creative philanthropic strategies and mission-related investing. This alignment of programs and investments led the foundation to support the fossil fuel divestment movement since its inception and to launch a new global campaign, SHINE, to end energy poverty. Ellen was awarded the 2016 inaugural Nelson Mandela Graça Machel Brave Philanthropy Award for launching Divest Invest Philanthropy, a coalition of over 180 foundations committed to deploying their investments to address the climate crisis and accelerate the clean energy transition. Please welcome Ellen Dorsey to Think 100%, the coolest show on climate change.
Come on, y'all, make some noise for Ellen, Dr. Ellen Dorsey! Ellen, welcome to Think 100%, the coolest show on climate change.
I am honored to be on the coolest show.
I'm so excited.
I'm not sure how I rated to get this spot.
I'm going to say right now, you're looking pretty spiffy there now. That's what I'm talking about.
I wore the gala scarf for Dana.
There it is.
Ellen, we are here at Confluence Philanthropy. Give yourselves another round of applause. We're in the room with a whole lot of philanthropists, but we got a whole bunch of folks who are listening also who may not really understand what philanthropy is all about. Can you just sort of break it down for folks?
Yeah, so philanthropy, there can be two kinds of philanthropy. The one is people give money. They give money to help achieve something that they believe in. That can be small dollars. You and I are all philanthropists when we give to something we believe in. And then there's also institutionalized philanthropy, like a foundation. So I work at a foundation. And basically, how do most foundations, private foundations, get created? Well, somebody made a lot of money, sometimes really a lot of money, and they can't spend it all, and they have charitable goals. They want to do something meaningful. So they create a foundation. And those foundations receive a charitable tax status because we serve the public good, right? So that's important because we're going to come back to that notion that we serve the public good. And then the important thing for this group of foundations, everybody that's in this room is trying to not just use grant dollars to help nonprofits, because that's what foundations do. We make checks to nonprofit organizations, social justice, environmental, women's rights organizations. But we also have money that's invested. So somebody gave money, set up that foundation, and that money gets invested. Like old school investing, old school, old boy investing, usually Wall Street. And that money creates returns, that you make money from how you invest that money. And 5%, at least 5% of that money every year goes into grant making. That's how foundations work. That's the typical model, not that everybody does it that way. So what's important to realize is lots of good things happen with those grant dollars, right? But there's a lot of power in philanthropy. And that power's not always accountable. We have the power to choose who gets money. We empower people when we empower organizations when we give them grants. But we are also choosing not to empower other organizations. So there's complex issues around power.
Wow.
There's complex issues around whether we choose to invest in systemic change that changes society's power relationships, or we invest in incremental reform. Really big, different approaches, all under this rubric of philanthropy. And then there's another way that we have power, and that's in how we invest that money. Do we choose to invest in the big Wall Street funds? Do we choose to, and it's a choice, do we choose to invest in corporations that aren't doing good things for society? And do we choose to invest in the...
Explain what you mean when you say that.
So, okay, an obvious example for the coolest show on climate change is, do we choose to invest in fossil fuel companies?
Okay.
Fossil fuel companies who refuse to be good global citizens and accept the role that they are playing in this, life-threatening crisis,
Right.
and either choose to wind down or choose to transform their business model. But investors can be invested in those companies, even helping build their war chest that they use to deny the science of climate change, or to contribute to politicians so that maybe they won't vote on policies that will regulate their product and their emissions. So we invest, and we have choices to make about our power in investing.
Wow.
Wow is right. Peel back the layers for us, Ellen. What is the Wallace Global Fund doing? And you guys have gone on quite a journey to align yourself with investing and giving for maximum impact. Please tell us about that.
Well, our foundation works on issues of the environment and women's rights and defending democracy and social justice globally and in the US. Not a huge foundation. There are really big foundations. We're kind of medium, small size. We made the decision starting in 2009 that wall between how you invest your money and how you make grants to organizations, we were going to take that wall down. And that it wasn't okay to pretend like how we invest isn't related to our mission. Our money could either be invested in ways that are driving the problems that we ask our grantees to solve, or we can be investing in ways that align with the solutions and in partnership with our grantees and in partnership with social movements, bringing about justice and working on climate change. So we started overhauling our investments. It was a journey. When we started out, we were kind of old school approach, and we sat down and said, what are our values? What does it mean to invest in line with our values? And it was very clear, starting in 2009, we had to get out of fossil fuels. We had to get out of mining. We had to invest, we had to get out of the extractive and exploitive industries. And we had to apply human rights lens to our investments. We didn't want to be in companies that exploited workers, exploited women. So we had to begin to look for ways to invest in the kinds of companies that are bringing about a more just and transformative world. That journey still continues, just like our grant making, we're constantly trying to improve in our grant making, we have to constantly improve in our investments as well. But it turned our institution upside down, and I'll just give you a couple of highlights about that. It turned our institution upside down in a really good way. Our program staff sits with our investment team. We think about how we can do things differently. We got rid of some managers, we identified new managers. I want to give a shout out to Catherine Chen and Tom Van Dyke from RBC. They've been our partners in this. And we now today, almost a decade later, we're 100% ESG integrated. That basically means, for your listeners that might not know that terminology, that we look at environmental, social, and governance issues in our investments.
Say it one more time.
Environmental, social, like human rights, and governance, like good governance. You got women on your board. If you have people of color on your board, that's good governance. If you don't, that's bad governance. So ESG.
I like that.
How was that? A little simple, little simple.
I love it, yes.
Right.
ESG, 100% ESG. We have commitments to renewable energy, to climate solutions, to energy justice, and to reach people with clean and safe energy that don't currently have it today. We're about 16% invested in climate solutions. And we have impact investments that advance our values on women's rights and social justice in other ways, which we can talk about. But the good part of the story is the way we invest saved us a ton of money, because we're kind of like getting hosed in fees and commissions. So once we overhauled it, we saved money. And then the investments themselves are doing great. Like, we beat our benchmarks every year. And I'll give you an example. In 2017, we did close to 22% returns. And that's really high. And we made the decision, the board and the investment committee and the staff, board mostly made this decision, that we would take our returns at the end of 2017 and put them all back into grants into 2018. We doubled our grant budget because we felt it's not okay to grow your endowment when we have a crisis of democracy and a climate crisis.
Wow. Yes. Amazing.
I like that. So I have two questions. As you're talking, I hear in the background of your voice, there's something there in which not everybody in your sector is doing that. I could be wrong.
Wow.
That was smooth. That was smooth.
But I hear that in your voice. There seems like there's a sense, in the words of Dr. King, a sense of urgency that you're trying to get out. So explain why I'm hearing that, because clearly that means that not everybody is doing that.
Well, I think we're moving too slow. Let me start by saying that when we are thinking about the babies, and we're thinking about the people on the front lines of the climate crisis today, this isn't what's happening in 20 years. What's happening in 20, 50, 100 years is apocalyptic. What's happening today is horrific. When we see these climate impacts every day, and we understand that those that are most impacted are those that had the least to do with the problem and feel the effects the worst. We have an ethical and moral responsibility to step outside of the standard operating procedures that got us to this point and say we must do it differently.
Right.
So Ellen, on Think 100%, we've talked about divest, invest. We've had shows on there. You know, we've had folks who you've worked with who've come on and who've shared, and we're really proud about that. But I'm not sure if everybody in the room understands what divest, invest looks like. But I want to set something up for you. Everybody say divest. Divest. Invest.
Invest.
That was just pitiful. Y'all try it
Was.
again. Divest.
Divest.
Invest.
Invest.
So can you just break it down a little bit for folks?
Wow, that's tough to follow. I'll do my best.
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to put it in rhyme. I think the basic premise is that it's no longer okay to invest in fossil fuels. If you own fossil fuels, you own climate change, and you need to be very clear about that. And instead, we have an opportunity to deploy our resources towards the solutions. And I'm not just talking about large-scale renewables. We're talking about deploying our resources for a just transition, to frontline communities, for community development, to reach the people that don't have electricity today, and to achieve economic and racial justice while we make the energy transition. And that's what Invest is about. But what's exciting about this story is beginning in 2011, students started organizing campaigns on their college campuses saying that they no longer wanted their universities to invest in fossil fuels. And very quickly, those campaigns began to multiply. And two brilliant people helped accelerate that. One who's in the room, I believe, Mark Campanelli, who came up with a brilliant analysis about, hey guys, these oil and gas and coal companies have way too much of it. They can't ever burn it or they'll cook the planet. So these are actually bad investments, making a strong ethical argument as to why you're going to lose your shirt if you stay in them. Then Bill McKibben linked the bubbling up of divestment campaigns with the stranded asset risk argument and threw down in a Do the Math tour and article in Rolling Stone and said, get out of the fossil fuels. Everybody needs to divest. And this thing exploded overnight. 40 campuses went to 400, spread to faith groups, spread to pension funds, cities, and even us. 200 foundations now have committed to divest and invest. Took a while, a lot of organizing. Thanks to Lisa, Jenna, and Clara.
Come on.
Who helped on divest.
Oh, yeah.
So what began as a David and Goliath campaign to say we're going to take away the social license of the fossil fuel industry to operate because they are not changing, they're lying about the science, and they're buying off our politicians, and we're going to say no more, you're toxic. That movement now is fully global. There are campaigns all over the world, and today, in 2019, what is that, 9 years later? There are 1,000 institutions that have publicly committed to divest with assets of $8 trillion under management.
Oh, wow.
Now that's a youth movement. And why it was important for philanthropy to support this movement is not to profile us and say, oh, look, we did it, we divested. It was about getting behind and supporting the movement, putting the wind at the back of those students and saying, we support your demands for social change. And we're going to put our portfolios up and show that we can do it. And we're going to move the market for fossil-free products, and we're going to help accelerate that. So that the 200 foundations, you supported the movement. To those of you that haven't yet done it, it is not too late to be on the right side of history.
All right.
Say it.
And on that note, man, thank you, Ellen, for joining us
Thank you,
and being
Ellen.
a part on the coolest show on
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Amy Goodman is the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, a national, daily, independent, award-winning news program airing on over 1,400 public television and radio stations worldwide. Time Magazine named Democracy Now! Its pick of the podcast. Amy has co-authored 6 New York Times bestsellers. Her latest, Democracy Now! 20 Years Covering the Movement's Change in America, looks back over the past 2 decades of democracy now and the powerful movements and charismatic leaders who are reshaping our world. The Neiman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard honored Amy with the 2014 IF Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence Lifetime Achievement Award. She is also the first journalist to receive the Right Livelihood Award, widely known as the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, for developing an innovative model of truly independent grassroots political journalism that brings to millions of people the alternative voices that are often excluded by the mainstream media. Please welcome Amy Goodman to Think 100%, the coolest show on climate change.
Come on, y'all. Make some noise for Amy Goodman. Amy, welcome to Think 100%, the coolest show on climate change.
It's great to be with you, and yes, it's very cool, outside and inside here.
All right, Amy, so it's usually us on Democracy
I
Now!
know.
So now we got you a little bit.
That's kind of fun.
And I'm honored. I'm just super honored. I'm like a fanboy, so it's all good.
Well, I mean, I just have to say that we interviewed Mustafa when he quit the EPA. He was the first one to quit the Environmental Protection Agency right after being there for almost
400 years.
How many years?
400.
400 years.
400 years.
After President Trump came into office, and you
Yeah.
wanted to be a
He
part
started
of
in
that.
1619, actually.
Rev got jokes. We're going to turn it up in a little bit. But you and your team have just been killing it. You guys have been on top of climate change for a long time now, from Copenhagen to Poland.
Right.
You guys make sure that you are capturing those stories of folks who sometimes don't get attention, of issues that don't get attention. So I'm interested, and I'm leaning in.
Me too.
I'm curious.
Let me lean.
What are some of those stories that really stick out in your mind?
I mean, you just talked about Poland. We've been covering the UN Climate Summit for the last, 10 years. From Copenhagen to Durban, South Africa, Doha. We were in Cancun when it was there. We were in Peru, in Lima. We were in Paris at the Climate Summit where an agreement was made and then President Trump pulled out of it. Most recently, we're in Katowice, Poland. Amazing that it was in Poland. We were in a convention center. This was coal country of coal land, Poland. We were in a convention center that was shaped like a coal mine.
Wow.
Celebrating coal. And that's what the Trump administration was doing there. Although they're saying they're pulling the U.S. out of the UN climate agreement, they do send their representatives to represent the fossil fuel industry. I had to chase the U.S. representative. I don't know if any of you saw this. I went up to him. You go to democracynow.org and
You know,
click.
you're pretty fast. I'm going to take
We had just finished the show. It was 2 to 3 there. It's 8 in the morning live here, based in New York. And I think that was the day that we interviewed Greta Thunberg, who you may all have heard of, this remarkable 16-year-old activist. She was 15 at the time. You know, her Twitter handle is like 16-year-old Swedish climate activist with Asperger's. And she said she sees the world in a different way.
That's right.
With Asperger's, she sees it in black and white. When she was 9 years old, we had her on, then brought her dad on to talk about how they changed their lives. Because Greta focused on climate change for 2 years, when she was 9 and 10 and 11 years old. Wow. And she then stopped eating, and she stopped speaking. She said, "What are you doing? You are only lying to us." And her parents stopped everything, focused on her. She went on this past year a school strike. She stood in front of the Swedish parliament for 3 weeks straight, every single day. The MPs would say, "Go to school." And she said, "We have done our homework. You haven't."
Come on now.
And after the election there, she started going every week, leading climate school strike, and has launched a movement around the world. When we were at the UN Climate Summit in Poland, she was addressing the world plenary. And she was saying to them, "You are acting like children. Wow. So let the real children lead, she said. She just addressed the European Union in Brussels. I believe she's going to meet with the Pope. And on March 15th, since we're interviewing kids all over the country right now on Democracy Now!, they are leading, because of Greta, a global climate strike. Right. In fact, just a few days ago, our guests are getting younger and younger. We had Magdalena and Rio, her brother. Magdalena's 10, Rio's 12. And then we also had Isha Clark on. She was elderly, she was 16. And they are three of the kids who confronted Senator Dianne Feinstein in her office in California. And I mean, they went as young as 7 years old, and they were demanding she support a global Green New Deal, the Global Green Deal. And Dianne Feinstein, the senator, said, I have 30 years on you. I know what I'm doing. And one of them said, but, you know, you represent us. She said, how old are you? And she said, I'm 16, Isha said. And she said, well, you can't vote. You didn't vote for me. And so Isha said, yes, but you must represent all of your constituents. And Magdalena, the 10-year-old, said, yeah, but it's us who are going to be affected by it, so you have to listen to us. It is astounding. They're all getting ready for March 15th.
That's right.
Kids are going to be walking out all over the country, and not only all over the country, but around the world. But to provide a forum for people to speak for themselves, that is absolutely critical. You have the pundits on television that tear apart new proposals, but you have a new critical mass in Congress, and you have kids recognizing. I mean, when you have these kids in California saying, you understand, we live with forest fires. We are afraid. There are mudslides, forest fires. We go to Florida, we go to Louisiana, and you're talking about massive rainstorms. You're talking about some of the coldest weather in the Northeast. And young people understand we are in trouble. Right. In Britain, there's an organization called Extinction Rebellion, and they are super gluing themselves everywhere to call attention to what's happening. And, you know, I think it all started a few years ago, the modern movement, with the standoff at Standing Rock. That's right.
No, and speaking of that, I mean, first, let me say for these young folks, we actually had many of those amazing young folks on our season 1. I think 100%. We had young folks on from the Sunrise Movement, 0 Hour, the plaintiffs who are suing the U.S. government on climate. So that was very pivotal. And one of the things that just touched me with those young people was this. They would be in this position. They would say that our parents and our parents' parents in the 20th century fought for equality. But we are now fighting for existence. And so if we don't get it right now, then we don't have a chance. Which leads to Standing Rock, because you mentioned Standing Rock, and I was at Standing Rock, and I wear many hats. The hat I had on earlier was Minnie Riccioni, was Water is Life, and then this hat actually, the hat I had on today, is Flint still doesn't have clean water.
Right.
But your coverage of Standing Rock became almost a story in itself. And then almost you became the story as well. So can you tell us what happened, what it was like for you what does it happen when the journalist becomes the story?
Well, you know, the critical point is that in 2016, in the midst of the presidential election year in this country, where climate change is such an important issue, in the general election debates, not one of, I don't even call them journalists, I call them news personalities on television.
Come on now.
Not once did they raise the issue of climate change. And I was up in Albany on a panel sponsored by Bob Schieffer of CBS, who was involved in these debates. And he's retired now. And I said, Bob, not once. I mean, I would go on, I'm invited on CNN and MSNBC, and you know, I'd say, why aren't you covering the issue of climate change? And they would say, well, the executives upstairs say people's eyes glaze over. Really? Really? I think because they're terrified, not because they're bored.
That's right.
And I said to Bob, how can it be this critical issue of the day, 2016, you had the standoff at Standing Rock, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Not one of you raised this issue in the main debates. And he said, okay, maybe there we were wrong, he said. So let's talk about what indigenous people and their allies were doing in North Dakota. It was April 1st, 2016, that the unofficial historian of Standing Rock, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, opened her property along the Cannonball River to the resistance. The resistance? It's the resistance at the time to DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, that was going to be built. It was taking fracked oil from the oil fields of North Dakota through North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, and it was going to link up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And they were saying, no, we don't want it on our land. They actually weren't very different from other North Dakotans. The people of Bismarck, the capital, said, we don't want it going through our capital. And so their views were respected. The people of Mandan, where the courthouse and the prison are, where so many hundreds of Native Americans have been imprisoned protesting DAPL, the people of Mandan said, we don't want it here. Are you kidding? What if it broke, a pipeline broke and destroyed? And they respected their views. Unfortunately, the Standing Rock Sioux were not so lucky. They just said, we don't want it here. But that was just too bad for them because they said they were building it. And they were going to build it under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America. And the people were terrified that if there was a leak, it could endanger 17 million people downstream, and they are native and non-native alike. But it was the native people of Standing Rock who were saying, we're going to stop this. And so they took a stand. Now, we should have come there much earlier. We were covering it from afar. We're based here in New York, but we were covering it. But Labor Day weekend, now we're moving into the general election time. That was like September 2nd, September 3rd, that Labor Day weekend. We went to Standing Rock to be there to record the voices of people on the ground. And what we found was amazing resistance. I mean, you'd have older women in traditional garb, and you'd have girls, and they would have a water ceremony on these back rural roads of North Dakota, holding up just like this, glasses of water. And they would actually, as they move forward, they would be met by fully militarized sheriff's department. And they would offer the water. They'd say, this is for you, not just for us. This is for your children, not just ours. And these police departments, the sheriff's departments, they had tanks, they had MRAPs, they had drones, they had automatic weapons. You know the scene, maybe not from there, because the media was not covering that very much at the time, but you know it from Ferguson. You know what it looked like. The corporate media went in force to Ferguson, as they should have. Mike Brown gunned down by a white police officer. His body lay to bake in the hot August sun, hour after hour.
That's right.
And the people rose up, and they were met by the St. Louis Police Department's, suburban police departments, fully militarized. I mean, this is recycling in America today.
That's right.
You take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan, and you give them to the police departments of the United States. And as a number of police department sheriffs and heads of police departments have said, what do you think we're going to treat our citizens as when we're looking at them through the scope of a rifle? And even people like Norm Stamper, who led the police riot at the during 1999, the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, and he was forced out, as he should have been, the police chief of Seattle. He said, I made a terrible mistake. He said, I saw our nurses, doctors, farmers, teachers, environmentalists, labor activists, high school kids as the enemy, because we're looking at them through these guns. And so we opened fire with tear gas. We ran out of tear gas. He said we had to go to other states to go after the citizens and non-citizens of our country who were just concerned about what's going to happen to the planet. So that was way back then. So back to North Dakota. We are seeing these militarized police departments facing down against Native Americans. But the Native Americans didn't stop. That was Friday, we were covering that of Labor Day weekend. Saturday, we followed a group to a disputed area. They said it was their burial ground.
Yep.
And this was going to court. A judge would be ruling in a week. And the judge said, then you show me a map to prove this. And they did. They laid out a map to show the burial ground, gave it to the judge. The judge gives it to Energy Transfer Partners, which owns Dakota Access Pipeline, as judges do. And when the people went to plant their tribal flags, the bulldozers that had been way down the road all of a sudden were there, and they were excavating on this holiday weekend. The people were shocked. What are you doing? And they believed that Energy Transfer Partners had taken the map and leapfrogged their bulldozers from way down the road to destroy the area so it would be a moot point when the judge ruled. And people were furious. And it was women and girls who took a stand in front of the bulldozers, and they stood in front of them, a terrifying sight. These are land-crushing, massive machines. But the bulldozers pulled back, one after another, and the people came forward from the resistance camps, and there were many set up, the Red Warrior camp, the Sacred Stone camp. Hundreds of people came running when they heard what was happening, and the bulldozers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them were pulling back, and the people were moving forward. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed dogs on the protesters. And they don't call themselves protesters. They call themselves water protectors. And they unleashed dogs. We were videoing the whole time. I mean, it was unbelievable. We showed a dog with its mouth and its nose dripping with blood. Even the dogs were afraid. They'd be thrown into the crowd. They'd bite their way out. And the people ultimately prevailed. Even the guards took their dogs with the bulldozers, and they moved back. I mean, they prevailed at a ridiculously high price. Beaten, bullied, maced, tear-gassed. But they did prevail that day. And the Dakota Access Pipeline moved back the people. We had this video. We immediately posted it online that night. And this is an answer to the network corporate executives who say people's eyes glaze over. Within 48 hours, there were 14 million views of this video.
Wow.
So jump forward a few days, right before the judge rules. President Obama is in Laos for this historic meeting, and he's having his final democracy forum, bringing in young people from around Asia to talk about democracy. And the last person raises her hand from Malaysia. She had come to Laos, and she said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? She'd seen something online. She asked a question no American journalist publicly asked President Obama. He told the story eloquently about the history of Native Americans and the oppression of Native Americans. But when it came to DAPL, he said, I have to get back to you on that. And he reportedly came back to the White House. That was like Wednesday, Thursday of that week after Labor Day. And he saw the dog sicked on the people. And it wasn't lost on the first African-American president of this country, the significance of dogs. As Winona LaDuke, the great Native American activist, environmental activist from the White Earth Reservation who pitched her teepee right there, said to us that day. She said about the governor, she said, Governor, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama 1963. We are through. So we go back to New York. We're continuing to cover what's happening. On Thursday, the judge is going to rule on Friday. Governor Dalrymple, that was his name at the time, called out the National Guard. It did not look promising for the Native Americans, the decision the next day. What we didn't know is that the authorities quietly issued that Thursday an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know this. Friday, after the show, after Democracy Now!, me and my colleague flew to Toronto for the film festival. They were doing a film on the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone, who said, if you can remember 2 words, he said to young journalists, remember, governments lie. If you can remember 3, remember all governments lie. And that's the name of the documentary. And then it showed journalists and organizations following in the footsteps, so they chronicled Democracy Now!, so they asked us to come speak. So see, I wasn't fleeing the United States. We really had been invited. And the next day, I always carry my phone with me, or speak at the University of Toronto. I'm making this so fast, we don't have much time. And it was up 100 people, students at University of Toronto after the film. And my phone, a text comes in, it says you're under arrest. Now, I thought, is this some kind of scam? Did someone get my number? Is this like some young hacker who's like scaring me or something? So I look up at the audience, but I see it's a North Dakota number. I said, oh my God, this might be true. And I thought, if there is an arrest warrant for you, you're not automatically going to be arrested like right there. But if you have any encounter with the FBI or the police or border guard, you will be arrested. And I thought,
I know.
I am in Canada. I have to go over the border. So I thought, I am not going to say anything to this group. I just said, could someone call me a cab? So I raced to the airport. I thought, if I can beat the arrest warrant going into the system. Yeah. And so I did, and I came back to New York. And I mean, yes, it was true, and I knew we had to go back to North Dakota because this, I didn't take this personally. This was a clear message to journalists around the country, do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we needed to be there. And I had to let young journalists know, you know, you don't have to be... Yeah. You don't have to get a record when you want to put things on the record. And if they don't have the institutional backing, the journalistic organization, they don't have to believe that if they want to cover something as important as this, bring out the voices of people on the ground, that they're going to end up in prison. We've got to challenge this. We've got to call their bluff. So a few weeks later, we got back on the plane. We're flying into Bismarck. We land, and I hear that they've dropped the charges. They've quashed the arrest warrant, which was very good. That they would, then I called my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, so what's going to happen? He said, well, actually, they're going to bring more serious charges against you, possibly felony riot charges. What? Riot? Like I'm a one-woman riot? What are they talking about? And he said, it's not the worst thing in the world. And I said, well, what do I face? He said, maybe a year in jail. I said, a year in jail? So I said, how much time do I have? He said, it's Friday, Monday at 1:30. You've got to turn yourself in. So I said, okay, good. We can cover the protest for 3 days. So we get out there, we cover the protest, and the show must go on. Monday morning, 8 o'clock New York time, 7 o'clock North Dakota time. We get a big broadcast truck. We rent it from Minneapolis. It comes up. And we decide to broadcast in Mandan in front of the courthouse and the jail. Because then I could just turn myself in after. And, and then, you know, it really, as 90% of life is just showing up, and the 10 commandments in between the courthouse and the jail. So we start broadcasting, and at the time, the tribal chairman was Dave Archambault, and the 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux. You know, like Trump is the 45th president of the United States. And I said to Dave Archambault, have you ever been arrested? And he said, well, yeah, I was arrested for civil disobedience. And I said, what happened to you? And he said, you know, low-level misdemeanor. And I said, and what happened? And he said, oh, I was strip searched. I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. Strip search for a minor misdemeanor? I mean, wow. And 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux, 45th president, you know, orange would match. And then I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle. She is the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Reservation. Right. Mm-hmm. I said, were you ever arrested? And she said, yes, I was one of the first because she cared about the health of the children. I said, what happened? She said, strip search, put in an orange jumpsuit and jailed. How much humiliation can a people take? And there were hundreds. I was at the airport one day in Bismarck. A guy came up to me and says, don't think I don't know who you are. I said, oh, well, who are you? And he said, I was one of the guards that day. I was there. And I said, were you one of the guards who unleashed dogs on the Native Americans? He said, no. He said, we were as surprised as you were. There were 3 different security companies that were hired, and one of them unleashed these dogs, he said. Wow. And he said, you know, he said, you don't think I understand. We have, he said, committed massacres against them for hundreds of years. Then we unleash dogs on them. You don't understand. You don't think I understand why they're angry at us? So I always say to young people, never assume someone's position based on the position that they occupy. So we do the show, and at the end of the broadcast, more and more Native Americans came to show solidarity. It got very crowded. Hundreds of people were performing ceremonies, and the riot police were lining up. It was getting very serious. And as the hours ticked down, I got a call from North Dakota Public Radio, a guy who'd been there for decades, knew all the players. It's not a big state, population-wise. And he said, he's not going to dare sign off on these charges against you. He can't do it with this kind of attention. And it wasn't only me. A number of Native Americans who faced felony and misdemeanor charges that day had their charges dropped. This is what happens when the media shines a spotlight in the right direction. I believe in reality television, not the kind he starred in. I'm talking about the kind that actually shows the reality of people's lives on the ground. That's the kind of media that we have to support all over this country and around the world and build up all over. Media that goes to where the silence is. And frankly, it is not always very quiet there. It is people who are speaking out, who often go unheard in the media. Don't hit that corporate media radar screen. We need a media that expresses the views of the majority of people.
That's right.
Because I think those who care about war and peace, those who care about the growing inequality in this country, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back.
Right. Oh, that's right.
Oh, man. That's so good and so true. Thank you. Oh, stepping out of your journalist role, how do the stories you cover on climate change and climate activism personally affect you? And what are your personal takeaways?
I mean, climate change, climate catastrophe, climate disruption affects everyone personally.
Yeah.
This is a personal issue. And I think especially young people understand what they are confronting. For me, it's just ensuring that people's voices are heard. That's what gives me the most hope. I mean, we're dealing with global catastrophes right now. But when you see people rising up, 7, 10, and 16-year-olds who are confronting their senators and saying, I may be too young to vote, but I'm the one who's going to inherit this, so you're going to listen to me. When you see indigenous people on the front lines, and by the way, DAPL did get built. The Dakota Access Pipeline did get built. But indigenous people, the Standing Rock Sioux, and their allies, it was the largest unification of native tribes from Latin America, the United States, First Nations of Canada that we have ever seen, are leading the struggle today. They're on the front lines of all the UN climate summits, whether they're outside getting arrested or sometimes inside actually addressing these plenaries. And so these are movements that are building. And when you hear the voices of people, yes, understanding what they face, but also talking about how they're organizing. There's nothing that's more exhilarating than seeing people taking all of our lives into their hands to save us all.
So, Amy, I guess for me, one, as I'm listening to you, on one hand, I'm filled with joy of hearing your story, but I'm also filled with a little bit of fear. From the standpoint, I remember when we were in New Orleans after Katrina, I remember when we were marching there, I remember having folks give me death threats, saying the N-word, if you cross that bridge, we're gonna kill you. And I remember, man.
And they did kill people.
And they did kill people, and I was like, I don't wanna die. And I think about you and your bravery as a journalist. And I think about this president and how he depicts with fake news. And I think about the journalists who were killed in Annapolis. I think about what's happening to all the different things. What's your response to that in regards to this president labeling fake news and what it means that journalists are literally being killed for reporting the story?
I mean, it is so serious that President Trump continually refers to the media as the enemy of the American people. The media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society. He's afraid of the truth, so he's afraid of the media.
Yes.
And I actually think most people across the political spectrum appreciate that, know how important it is, and also he has forced the media to find their backbone. I mean, I'm not talking about Fox. I'm talking also about MSNBC and CNN and the other networks. So often they provide a forum for the talking heads of the establishment. Now they are sounding a little like Democracy Now!, like we're essential to the functioning of a democratic society, they will say. And they are reinforcing to people why the media is so important, because he has threatened them directly, called out their names. And I don't support that in any way, but it's really important to see the media really showing how important it is to be the fourth estate, not a part of the parties, but we are not supposed to be state media. You know, so often, for example, Fox is the closest to state media we have, but before that, you really had to ask, if we had state media in this country, how would it be any different? Yes, they're finding a backbone, and they're speaking in an oppositional way to President Trump. But when it comes to two issues, they cannot break away from their knee-jerk reactions, and that is on the issue of war and climate change. On the issue of war, I remember when President Trump sent those 58 Tomahawk missiles into a Syrian airbase. Syria, absolutely critical issue of the day. And I can't remember who it was on CNN. I think it was, I came home late that night and I turned on Brian Williams on MSNBC. In 30 seconds, he talked about the beauty of the armaments in flight 3 times. The beauty of the armaments, quoting Leonard Cohen, who would have rolled over in his grave. And then it was Fareed Zakaria on CNN when Trump dropped the Moab, the nickname for it, the mother of all bombs. That's the Pentagon's nickname, the massive ordnance air blast. It has like a mile radius on Afghanistan. Inexplicably, just dropped it. Bush had developed it, didn't dare use it. Obama didn't dare use it. And then Trump, within weeks in office, just drops this bomb on Afghanistan. And it was Fareed who said something like he became president that night. We have to be separate from the state. And of course, when it comes to climate change, think how often these networks are bringing you weather. I mean, the nonstop, the hurricanes, the tornadoes on the ground, the flooding. And this is very important. Every 5 or 6 minutes, right, we get weather reports. And they'll flash extreme weather, severe weather. What about another 2 words? Climate change, climate chaos. It's not just about what we're going to wear that day, the weather. It's about what we're going to do about this. It is an existential threat, and people do care when they know. These weather events are so disparate. Coldest weather ever, Dust Bowl conditions in the Midwest, the fires in California, they don't seem to be connected unless we talk about it in a serious way. When it's cold in New York, Trump says, ha-ha, and they're talking about global warming. Right. That makes sense to someone who doesn't understand, could be very intelligent. That's what the media has to do, is really explain what this is all about, that when you heat up the planet, it's going to express itself in all different ways, and it might be freezing weather, or it might be the waters rising, and these are all connected. And we have to demand that the media, they have licenses to operate in the public interest, that they use those licenses in a responsible way or have their licenses revoked.
Yes. Absolutely.
Amy, thank you so much. Thank you for...
And thank you for
so
all
much.
that you do.
Yes, thank you for your wisdom, your experiences, and for your leadership. Can we give her another round of applause?
Give it up. Give it up, y'all, for the amazing Amy Goodman.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much.
Like what you heard? Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and visit think100.info to learn more about the issues and donate to this project.
Also, be sure to follow us at Think100 Show and at Hip Hop Caucus on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Use hashtag Think100. Thanks again, and all power to the people.
Think 100, think 100.